In Atlanta, Georgia, in the year 2012, the summer air carried a heavy stillness that seemed out of place with the chaos unfolding inside the Mitchell household. The day had begun like any other, yet it ended with the kind of rupture that left scars across generations. The reading of the will took place in a wood-paneled office downtown, where the echoes of authority and legacy hung in the air. When the lawyer cleared his throat and announced the figure, $33 million, the silence that followed was almost unbearable. The granddaughter, Claire, had inherited everything from her grandmother's estate: the properties, the investments, the accounts, even the family home. The mother, Evelyn, who had given her life to raising Claire and preserving the family's dignity through years of struggle, was left with nothing but the shock of erasure. Evelyn's mind drifted through fragments of memory as she sat rigid in her chair. She remembered the grandmother's fragile hands holding both of theirs at Sunday dinners, the whispered reassurances that family was everything, and the countless times she had believed that promises of loyalty meant protection. But in a single declaration, the legal system had erased her from the narrative. She left the office quietly, her chest tightening with each step, while her daughter's eyes already gleamed with the intoxication of sudden wealth. Back at the house, the change became tangible. The home that had always smelled of old wood and jasmine candles was now filled with the brisk sound of new authority. Boxes appeared, filled not with Evelyn's belongings but with documents, plans, and the faint smell of fresh ink on bank papers. Claire moved with a restless energy, pacing from room to room as though she were measuring her newfound dominion. Evelyn watched with a strange detachment, as though observing a stranger in the body of her child. The hours slipped into nightfall, and the atmosphere grew colder. The chandelier in the hallway cast fractured light across the floorboards, illuminating the distance between mother and daughter. Evelyn stood in the living room, her hand resting on the frame of a family photograph, sensing the storm she had not yet named. She had endured storms before: the abandonment of her husband, the lean years of survival, the whispers of relatives who doubted her ability to raise a child alone. Yet this storm was unlike any other, for it came not from an outsider, but from the very person she had nurtured, clothed and loved without reservation. By late evening, the unspoken words transformed into action. Claire's wealth had turned into power, and with that power came a decision that left Evelyn hollow. A suitcase appeared in the hallway, its leather cracked from years of use, and the reality of exile descended. Evelyn's belongings, reduced to the essentials, looked fragile and misplaced against the grandeur of the house. Her bedroom, once her sanctuary, stood stripped of personal traces, as if her existence could be neatly packed away and erased. The night air outside felt heavy and damp when she finally stepped beyond the threshold. The cicadas hummed in the trees, indifferent to the collapse of a life. The driveway stretched long and unfamiliar under the glow of street lamps, and the house behind her no longer felt like home, but like a fortress she had been banished from. Evelyn's footsteps echoed softly, mingling with the sound of distant traffic, each step pulling her further from the years she had poured into creating stability. In that moment, she did not think of the millions her daughter now possessed, nor the lavish future Claire was already imagining. She thought only of the raw emptiness pressing against her ribs, the silence where once there had been laughter, and the sudden absence of belonging. Money had severed something deeper than blood. It had dismantled the fragile bond of trust that had carried them through decades. Evelyn realized that her exile was not simply from a house or from wealth, but from the very role she had played as mother and anchor. Her departure was quiet, but inside her chest, the rupture roared. She had been dismissed not only from the estate, but from her daughter's sense of gratitude, from the narrative of family itself. The city skyline loomed in the distance as she walked, each light a reminder that the world continued indifferent to her grief. Yet in the shadows of that night, beneath the crushing weight of betrayal, Evelyn carried the one thing her daughter could never inherit through signatures or wealth: resilience carved from years of sacrifice. The exile marked her not as powerless, but as someone who had been tested in ways money could never measure. Though stripped of shelter, possessions, and even the identity of being needed, she carried a quiet dignity that refused to vanish. The betrayal was complete, the inheritance lost, the home gone. Still, in that silence, Evelyn's story had not ended. It had only shifted into something uncharted. The motel stood on the edge of the highway, its neon sign flickering against the humid Georgia night. Evelyn arrived with a single suitcase, and the heaviness of exile pressing against her chest. The receptionist barely looked at her as she slid a key across the counter, the impersonal gesture reminding her that she had moved from the warmth of a home into the anonymity of strangers' spaces. Her room smelled faintly of disinfectant and stale smoke, the faded curtains drawn against the distant hum of traffic. A single bed, a narrow dresser, and a buzzing ceiling fan formed her world for the next 3 days. On the first night, exhaustion claimed her body, but her mind refused rest. She lay on the creaking mattress staring at the water-stained ceiling, reliving every detail of the day. She remembered the sharp sound of the lawyer's voice, the gleam in Claire's eyes, the suitcase waiting in the hallway. She traced the memories like open wounds, unable to turn away from the disbelief that her own daughter had cast her aside. Each memory brought a deeper ache, the kind that spread from the chest into the bones. She thought of the years she had struggled alone, the double shifts at the diner, the nights sewing Claire's school costumes, the mornings walking her to the bus stop. Those sacrifices had seemed like investments in love, but in the stillness of the motel room, they felt like debts unpaid. By morning, the thin curtains let in a gray light that carried no warmth. Evelyn made coffee from the packet left on the counter, its bitterness echoing the hollow taste in her mouth. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands wrapped around the cheap plastic cup, and stared at the suitcase that now contained her life. It was not just the loss of the house that weighed on her, but the brutal clarity of having become a stranger to her own child. The motel's silence amplified her thoughts, each second stretching into long corridors of reflection. She thought of Claire's childhood, of the little girl who once clung to her hand in crowded stores, who whispered fears in the dark, who once called her the safest place in the world. That child seemed erased, replaced by someone hardened by sudden wealth and blinded by ambition. The second night carried a different weight. Anger surfaced between waves of grief. Evelyn sat at the small desk under the dim lamp, scribbling fragments of thoughts onto scraps of paper she found in her purse. Her handwriting shook as she wrote questions without answers. How had love turned into dismissal? What had she missed in the years that led to this rupture? She crumpled the papers and tossed them into the trash, yet the act brought a small release. In the solitude, anger gave her a pulse, a reminder that she was still alive, still capable of resisting despair. She pressed her palm against the cool glass of the window and watched headlights streak across the highway, each car carrying people whose lives moved forward, while hers had come to a sudden halt. The following day unfolded in slow fragments. Evelyn wandered the nearby streets, the sound of cicadas filling the heavy air. She stopped at a diner for breakfast, but the taste of food barely registered. She observed other patrons, truck drivers, families, young couples, and felt a strange distance from their worlds. She carried an invisible wound, one that no one could see, yet it colored everything in shades of loss. Returning to the motel, she stretched out on the bed and let the memories come in waves. She remembered her own mother's voice, urging her to be strong, to endure, to rise no matter how heavy the fall. Those words, buried for years, returned with quiet insistence. By the third night, something shifted inside her. The pain had not diminished, but it had transformed. The rawness of betrayal remained, yet beneath it grew a faint sense of resilience. She realized that solitude, though sharp and unwelcome, gave her a strange clarity. She no longer had to hide disappointment behind smiles, no longer had to protect anyone from truth. She was free in a way she had never been, though the freedom was laced with sorrow. Evelyn stood before the mirror in the dimly lit bathroom and studied her reflection. The lines on her face, the tired eyes, the set of her jaw, all spoke of years survived. She saw not weakness, but endurance carved deep into her features. When the morning sun of the fourth day filtered through the curtains, Evelyn rose with a steadier breath. She packed her belongings with deliberate care, folding each garment as though reclaiming order from chaos. The motel room, once a cell of grief, had become a crucible. It had burned away illusions, leaving her raw but unbroken. She stepped outside into the heat of the Georgia morning, the suitcase rolling behind her, and felt the first stirrings of resolve. The daughter who had turned her into an exile had also forced her into a rebirth. Solitude had shown her that even abandoned, she remained her own foundation. In the weeks that followed the inheritance, Claire's life transformed into a glittering carousel of excess. Atlanta's upscale districts became her playground, where neon lights and polished storefronts seemed to bend toward her with eager invitations. She walked through boutiques as if the city itself had been curated for her pleasure, each rack of designer clothing a stage set for her new identity. She moved from counter to counter with the assurance of someone who no longer considered price tags a limitation. Bags piled up in the back of chauffeured cars, evidence of her newfound status spilling into leather and silk. Restaurants that once seemed reserved for the untouchable elite opened their doors to her with a flourish. Hostesses greeted her by name within days, their smiles widening as they noticed the string of new companions trailing in her wake. Lobster tails, imported wines, and towers of desserts adorned her table, consumed in half-hearted bites while cameras flashed from her companions' phones. The food mattered less than the display. Each meal became another performance in the theater of wealth. Her laughter rang louder than it ever had, sharpened by champagne, filling the air with the brittle sound of someone intoxicated by attention. Strangers drifted into her orbit, drawn to the scent of money like moths to a flame. They flattered her relentlessly, telling stories of opportunities, ventures, and parties that seemed to stretch endlessly into the night. She welcomed them without hesitation, mistaking their presence for friendship, their smiles for loyalty. They whispered promises of partnerships, their words dripping with admiration, but beneath the compliments lay calculations. Each handshake carried the weight of silent negotiations, each toast a subtle request for access. Claire's phone buzzed constantly, a chain of messages from new acquaintances, event organizers, and glossy socialites who suddenly considered her essential. Invitations flooded in for charity galas, art showings, and exclusive gatherings where the price of entry was not measured in dollars, but in reputation. She arrived at each one dressed in fresh couture, her wrists adorned with jewelry that caught the light like prisms. Cameras found her face in every room, and within weeks, her image began appearing in society pages. To her, this was proof of victory. She had escaped obscurity and claimed a throne in the world of the admired. But beneath the sparkle, shadows gathered. Bankers began calling with polite but persistent reminders about asset management. Advisors offered unsolicited suggestions, their language laced with urgency, reminding her that fortunes required structure and discipline. Legal representatives approached her with thick folders, filled with clauses and signatures, their tones polite, but pressing. Claire nodded through the meetings, impatient to return to her whirlwind of indulgence, convinced that discipline was for those without imagination. She signed where they pointed, barely glancing at the details, dismissing each warning as unnecessary caution. The more she spent, the more the city seemed to shrink into familiar cycles of repetition. The boutiques knew her taste before she entered. The restaurants reserved her corner table without confirmation. The faces around her changed nightly, yet they all carried the same gleam of hunger, their compliments echoing one another until they blurred into white noise. Claire convinced herself she had become the mistress of her fate, the architect of her empire, yet she mistook performance for power. Her nights extended into dawn, each party louder and more elaborate than the last. Rooms filled with smoke, music, and strangers who spoke of her as if she were a legend in the making. Photographers captured her stepping out of cars, laughter spilling into the night, while behind her eyes exhaustion began to flicker. She ignored it, feeding the illusion that excess itself was vitality, that her pace proved her strength. The truth crept quietly, woven into the silence between bursts of music. She was not in control. She was being consumed. On the third week, a new circle of companions arrived, sleek and persuasive. They spoke of investments that promised to triple her wealth, of exclusive opportunities only someone of her stature could enter. They placed contracts before her, thick with clauses that demanded urgency. She leaned on the assurances of their smiles, mistaking their eagerness for sincerity, and with a flourish of her pen, she bound herself to obligations she did not comprehend. Applause followed each signature, glasses clinked, and Claire believed she was building empires. Yet each agreement was another thread pulling her deeper into a web she could not see. As the days blurred into a haze of glitter and noise, the line between freedom and captivity thinned. The city whispered her name in admiration, but the whispers of bankers, lawyers, and opportunists grew louder. They circled her like patient predators, waiting for the moment her momentum faltered. For now, Claire continued to float above the surface, carried by the illusion of easy money, unaware that the very tide lifting her would soon reveal its undertow. The third day arrived not with triumph, but with silence. The phone that once buzzed every hour now lay flat on the marble countertop, the stream of invitations and eager messages reduced to a trickle. Claire rose late, her head still heavy from the night before, and sensed immediately that something had shifted. The servants avoided her gaze, their movements cautious, as if the very air in the mansion had grown heavier. She wandered through gilded rooms that seemed larger than ever, each echo of her footsteps reminding her that the grandeur was less a home than an empty theater stage. The first warning came in the form of a polite email from the bank. Words like irregular activity and precautionary measures spread across the glowing screen, sterile yet terrifying. Access to one of her primary accounts had been suspended pending verification. She skimmed the message, her stomach tightening, and tried to log in again, only to be met with the same frozen notice. Panic pricked at the edges of her mind, but she pushed it aside with the rationalization that it was merely a technical error. She picked up her phone to call her new advisors, but no one answered. Voicemails replaced eager voices, and the empty beeps only deepened the chill in her chest. By afternoon, the shadows grew longer. The friends who had filled her evenings with laughter and photographs were nowhere to be found. Texts went unanswered, social media accounts vanished, and the once constant stream of people at her door had evaporated. She called 2 of the men who had introduced her to investment opportunities, only to discover their numbers were disconnected. She searched online for their companies, finding only broken links and vague warnings buried in obscure financial forums. The realization came slowly, heavy and sharp. She had been surrounded not by friends, but by predators. The second warning arrived with a knock at the door. A courier handed her a sealed envelope bearing the letterhead of a law firm she did not recognize. Inside lay pages of legal jargon, demanding documentation for investments she scarcely remembered signing. Words like breach of contract and legal recourse glared back at her, each phrase a reminder that her signature had weight she had not understood. She dropped the folder onto the glass table, her reflection fractured across its surface, and for the first time since inheriting her fortune, her hands trembled. As night fell, she retreated to the master suite, hoping the isolation of the high ceilings and velvet drapes would shield her from reality. But even there, the cracks widened. She attempted to pay for an online order, only to have her card declined. A second attempt with another account yielded the same result. Her fortune, which had felt limitless just days before, was suddenly inaccessible, caged behind systems she no longer controlled. The walls of her palace loomed higher, pressing in rather than protecting. The fourth warning emerged through her own reflection. She stood before a floor-to-ceiling mirror, still dressed in last night's gown, the fabric wrinkled and stained with spilled wine. The woman staring back at her looked nothing like the triumphant heiress of society pages. Her eyes were hollow, her shoulders slumped, and her skin carried the pallor of exhaustion. The mirror offered no illusions, only the image of someone adrift, clinging to a crown that was slipping faster than she could hold it. She drifted through the mansion in the early hours, each room a cavern of silence. The chandeliers sparkled coldly, their brilliance mocking rather than celebrating. The dining table, set for no one, stretched endlessly, a reminder of gatherings that had been performative rather than genuine. The swimming pool reflected the night sky, but the water was undisturbed, a mirror of stillness where once laughter had echoed. Her empire was not alive. It was a hollow structure, built on sand, collapsing under its own weight. The following morning brought yet another summons. This time, it was an email from an investor demanding immediate clarification of missing documents. Terms like compliance and penalties blared from the screen, their severity undeniable. Claire searched through her drawers, rifled through folders, and found nothing but glossy brochures and abandoned contracts with signatures she barely remembered giving. Each missing document was a brick removed from the fragile walls of her empire, and with every absence, the foundation weakened. By evening, the truth could no longer be denied. The wealth that had elevated her into glittering circles had turned into chains. The people who once surrounded her had vanished like smoke, leaving her alone in a mansion that no longer felt like triumph, but like punishment. The furniture gleamed, the paintings adorned the walls, but none of it carried warmth. The empire she had imagined was nothing more than a sandcastle at the edge of the tide, beautiful at first glance but fragile, destined to collapse with the slightest wave. The cracks were no longer subtle. They stretched wide and deep, revealing the emptiness beneath. Claire sat alone in the vast living room, the silence pressing against her like an accusation. The empire of easy money had revealed its truth. Not a fortress, not a kingdom, but a hollow shell that crumbled faster than she could gather the pieces. The empire Claire had built from sudden wealth had collapsed faster than she could have imagined. By the time the fifth day arrived, her mansion stood like an abandoned stage, the velvet curtains drawn back to reveal nothing but dust and silence. Her accounts remained locked, her supposed friends disappeared, and her phone, once a lifeline of invitations, rang only with demands from lawyers and creditors. The weight of the fortune she had flaunted now pressed down on her chest, like an anchor dragging her beneath the surface. For the first time since the inheritance, she stopped pretending. She sat at the long dining table, staring at a spread of unopened envelopes stacked in neat piles. Each bore the insignia of banks, firms, or agencies, their language cold and merciless. She tore one open, her hands shaking, and read phrases like immediate action required and pending litigation. Another envelope contained a statement that listed withdrawals she did not remember authorizing, amounts so large her breath caught in her throat. Her own signature appeared at the bottom of contracts she could barely recall signing, a cruel reminder of how recklessly she had surrendered her control. The silence of the house became unbearable. Every polished surface reflected her isolation. Every chandelier seemed to mock her illusions of grandeur. She wandered from room to room, the echo of her footsteps the only sound. The pool outside shimmered under the sunlight, but its calm surface mirrored her emptiness. She pressed her palm against the cold glass of the sliding door, her reflection blurring with the blue water, and realized how far she had drifted from the girl she once was. That afternoon, her phone lit up again, but the screen displayed nothing she wanted to see. It was another number linked to collections, another reminder that the tide was rising. She let it ring until the silence returned, then stared at the device as if it might deliver a miracle. The thought she had resisted for days finally broke through. There was only one person she could call, the one person she had cast aside. Her pride recoiled instantly at the idea, but desperation pressed harder. She sat at the edge of her bed, the curtains drawn tight, her fingers trembling above the phone. Memories surged uninvited. Her mother sewing late into the night, standing in the rain to watch her school plays, cooking meals with whatever little they had. She saw her mother's face the day she walked out with the suitcase, the quiet grief that spoke louder than anger. Claire had dismissed that look as weakness, but now, in the emptiness of her palace, she recognized it for what it was. Strength disguised as silence. Her chest tightened as she dialed, the digits both familiar and foreign after days of avoidance. The ring on the other end stretched endlessly, each second heavier than the last. When the line finally connected, Claire's voice failed her at first. She tried to summon the authority she had once wielded, but it collapsed under the weight of her fear. What came out instead was a broken sound, unsteady and stripped of control. The words spilled unevenly, carrying the weight of an admission she had never made before. She confessed not in rehearsed sentences, but in fragments, acknowledging that she had destroyed what mattered most. She admitted that the money had blinded her, that she had surrounded herself with vultures, that the mansion was nothing but a shell without her mother's presence. Each word cut deeper than the last, not because she wanted forgiveness, but because she finally understood the enormity of what she had lost. Pride, which had been her armor, shattered into pieces too small to gather. The silence on the other end felt endless, but Claire kept speaking, her voice shaking, her breath uneven. She begged not for money, not for the restoration of her fortune, but for guidance, for the stability her mother had always carried even in hardship. In that moment, she realized the wealth she had discarded in her arrogance was not measured in accounts or estates, but in the quiet resilience of the woman she had thrown out. When the call ended, Claire sat frozen, the phone heavy in her hand. The house remained silent. The envelopes still waited. But something within her had shifted. For the first time since her windfall, she acknowledged her own fragility. The empire of easy money had not made her powerful. It had exposed her emptiness. Only now, in the rawness of desperation, did she see clearly the foundation she had destroyed with her own hands. As night settled over Atlanta, the mansion seemed darker than ever, but the act of calling, of breaking her pride, left a faint trace of something unfamiliar. It was not relief, nor redemption, but a fragile beginning, the recognition that the path forward depended not on wealth, but on the one bond she had betrayed, and now sought to restore. Evelyn returned to the mansion 3 days after the desperate call, not as a guest and not as an exile, but as a woman who had survived the fire of betrayal. The drive through Atlanta's crowded streets felt strangely calm, each traffic light giving her space to breathe, and each mile affirming her decision. When she reached the gates, the towering iron stood open, as though the house itself had been waiting. She stepped out of the car with steady hands, her posture upright, her eyes clear. The place that had once rejected her now felt smaller, less intimidating, because she no longer saw it as the measure of her worth. Inside, the air was heavy with silence. The chandeliers sparkled faintly, but there were no voices, no gatherings, no laughter to fill the cavernous halls. Claire appeared in the entryway, not adorned in glittering gowns or flanked by companions, but dressed plainly, her shoulders hunched, her face pale. The arrogance that had once burned in her gaze was extinguished. She looked smaller than Evelyn remembered, almost fragile. The daughter who had once cast her out now carried the weight of her mistakes like chains. Evelyn did not rush forward with anger or with comfort. She simply stood, allowing the silence to stretch until it became clear who held the power now. Claire lowered her eyes first, a gesture that spoke louder than any apology. Evelyn's footsteps echoed as she walked into the living room, her gaze scanning the disarray, piles of unopened envelopes, abandoned contracts, half-empty glasses of untouched wine. The empire that had promised invincibility was nothing but debris. She sat deliberately at the head of the long dining table, the place that symbolized authority, and waited until Claire followed. The daughter hesitated before taking a seat across from her, fidgeting with her hands, her eyes darting nervously to the papers scattered between them. The imbalance of power was unmistakable now. Evelyn had once been the one cast aside. Yet here she was, calm and composed, while her daughter trembled under the weight of her own collapse. Evelyn listened quietly as Claire stumbled through fragmented explanations. The younger woman spoke of fraud, of accounts frozen, of threats from investors and lawyers. Her words carried the desperation of someone grasping at fragments of a broken world. Evelyn allowed the torrent to continue until Claire's voice thinned into silence, until every excuse and every fear had spilled into the open. Only then did she speak, her voice steady, her tone neither cruel nor tender, but filled with clarity. She made it clear that forgiveness would not be cheap. Help would come only on her conditions. Respect was the first price. No more dismissive tones, no more arrogance that stripped her of dignity. Honesty was the second. No secrets, no hidden documents, no signatures scrawled blindly across papers promising empty wealth. Recognition was the third, that Claire would acknowledge her strength, her resilience, the years of sacrifice that had been dismissed in favor of strangers with hungry smiles. Claire nodded, her eyes glassy with a mixture of shame and relief. For the first time, she accepted that wealth had not made her powerful, but vulnerable, and that the only stability left was the mother she had betrayed. Evelyn watched the acknowledgement settle into her daughter's face like a slow dawn. There were no dramatic tears, no loud apologies, only the quiet surrender of pride to truth. The next hours were filled with order rather than chaos. Evelyn sorted through the mess with deliberate care, setting aside the documents that mattered and discarding those that carried only false promises. She contacted lawyers of her own choosing, spoke with clarity to bankers who had grown accustomed to evasive answers, and began to build a framework of protection. The mansion no longer felt like a fortress of loneliness, but like a structure being reclaimed under her terms. Claire watched silently, her posture shifting gradually from despair to cautious hope, though she knew that her place within this new balance had been forever altered. As dusk settled, Evelyn stepped outside onto the balcony overlooking the city. The lights of Atlanta glittered against the horizon, not as symbols of envy, but as reminders of resilience. Claire stood a few feet behind her, waiting, hesitant to break the moment. Evelyn inhaled deeply, feeling the warm air press against her skin, and realized that the true victory was not in reclaiming wealth or in punishing betrayal. It was in reclaiming herself. She had returned not as a victim seeking acceptance, but as a woman who had endured and chosen her path. The price of forgiveness had been named, and it had been paid not in dollars, but in humility, recognition, and respect. In that exchange, Evelyn found something wealth could never buy: the quiet dignity of knowing she had risen above humiliation and reclaimed control over her life.